everyone. Thank you for coming. So to start off the day today, we're going to be talking not so much about creating worlds, but about how to handle your creations before and after you make them. I am Redhound. I am an attorney licensed in the state of California. I represented tech companies large and small in a variety of intellectual property and business matters for 10 years. So I've done this kind of thing for a while. However, professional norms require me to state that none of what I'm about to say is legal advice. If it was legal advice, I would need to ask you a lot more questions about your specific situation. One issue being the further you get from California, the less I know about exactly what laws apply. But in general, the principles I'm talking about today should apply in most situations. There's a lot of commonality on the things that control licensing throughout the world. So first off, why care about licensing? A lot of people, they sort of they're hesitant to get involved in any sort of license situation because it's complicated. They're worried people will be offended. Why not just rely on people's common sense? And the reason is that everyone's common sense is different. And so the reason that you want to actually think about your licensing is clarity. Just communicate to yourself and to everyone else what it is that you expect about how your material is going to be used. And indeed, even outside of the license, that's kind of a good thing to think about. I mean, how would you feel if people used your material in XYZ sort of way? Another thing is if you're doing commissioned work, especially for people outside of the community, like when, a TV network wants a VR world, something like that, they may have needs that you're going to need to kind of understand. And the last thing is also that you are users of licenses. The tools that you use, the assets that you use, those are also controlled by licenses. Unity, VRChat, all of those, you are using licensed material from them. And in general, those licenses are very broad and shouldn't limit you in any way, but it's good to be aware that that's a thing that's happening. So first I want to go over kind of the basics of how contracts work. And you may know some of this, but it's just good to have it all in one place. So basically a contract consists of four things. There's an offer. Someone says, hey, let's make this agreement. There's an acceptance. Another person saying, yes, I agree. Let's make that agreement. Intent. You both actually intend this is an agreement. This is going to be binding on both of us. And consideration. There has to be some kind of obligation on both sides. So if you just say, hey, I'm going to do this thing, and someone says, yes, I agree that you're going to do that thing, that's not a contract, that's just a promise. Am I? I'm sorry.
You want to click next one more time, so you're on,
okay.
You're
I'm sorry.
At the next slide.
You're right, I am. I'm so sorry. Okay, so
it's okay.
I apologize. One thing that's important to note, a contract does not have to be formally signed. All of the things that you think of when you think of a contract, you can have a contract without those things. A contract doesn't have to be signed. It doesn't even have to be written down. But whenever you can, you do want to write it down because, as I said, the point of all this is clarity. You want to make sure that you and the people you're making agreements with have the same understanding of what it is that you're doing. Now, sometimes that's not possible. So on the internet, we often see a lot of what are called in the biz browse wrap agreements, where the idea is someone says, hey, this is the agreement under which you can use my stuff. And if you use it, that's you agreeing to these terms. And that works. That has been held to be sufficient. But it does get a little dodgy because if there's an argument, people sometimes say, well, I didn't know, I didn't see those terms, I didn't agree to them. So working it out in detail is great if possible, but again, sometimes it's not, especially when you're not actually going to be in communication with the people who are going to be using the things that you distribute. And then a little basics on copyright. So copyright is the main intellectual property right that covers artistic works and software. And copyright comes into existence at the moment that something is created. And it belongs to the person who created it unless that person is creating it for their employer, which I don't think is the case for anyone here. So at the moment you create something, you own the copyright in it. And that means that you have the right to stop people from doing various things with your work, to stop them from copying it, to stop them from distributing it, to stop them from changing it. But you can give permission. That's what a license is, giving permission to someone to do something with a work where you own the copyright that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do. One issue that can come up, particularly with freely distributed material, is sometimes people think, hey, it's on the internet, it's free, I can do whatever I want. And that's not true, but there is a certain extent of, if you put something on the internet, it's sort of implied that you expected people to look at it. You know, if you put something up for free download, if someone then downloads it, there's an argument to be made that even though you didn't say, I give you a license to do this, there's what's called an implied license for that. Again, though, without the clarity, that can get kind of mushy. So as I say, we're looking for clarity. We're looking for understanding what it is that we want in our license. And the first step in that is kind of thinking about, what is it that you want? What are you trying to accomplish? What do you care about in how people use your work? So a big one is probably the biggest one for a lot of people is attribution. You know, if you use my stuff, tell people that you used my stuff. Let people know that I did that. So a lot of people care a lot about that. And a tricky thing is attribution is not one of the rights in copyright. You have to get that. You have to get an agreement for attribution. You know, you can't. I guess what I'm saying is you cannot force people through copyright to give you credit. It's not one of the things that's within copyright. And so that's one of the things that a license can do for you. Another thing that's important a lot is commercial use. You know, often people are happy for people to use things personally, you know, just doing your own thing. But if you're making money from it, I don't want you to do that. Or I want to cut. Or I want you to come talk to me and we'll figure out what we're going to do. Another big one is redistribution. You know, a lot of times, especially in a commission context, people will be like, okay, so I'm going to make this thing, I'm going to give it to you, and then you can have it and you can do what you want with it, but you can't then give it to other people. And actually, especially for things that I'm wrong, a commission's not the biggest thing for that. Probably the biggest application is where you're distributing something, but you want to be the source of it. You know, if you have a thing, someone says, hey, that's awesome, you want them to say, okay, yeah, you need to go to that place where I have it for download, not, hey, I'm going to just send you a copy and have it go all over the place. And then another thing that comes up sometimes is people care about specifically how something's going to be used. You know, so people sometimes will make assets for use in a specific context on a specific platform. You know, so I'm going to make you this avatar, but this is for VRChat. You can't use this to stream, or as a VTuber, or you know, any number of other things. Or also a thing that comes up a lot is people say, I don't want you to use my assets for porn. That's a big one that you see in the license sections of a lot of asset stores. And you could have any number of those kinds of things that you care about. What is the way that things get used that would hurt your feelings, that would upset you? And so think about that. You know, think about, how do you want people to use your stuff? How would you be upset if they used your stuff that way? And then when you have that in mind, you'll be able to kind of think more clearly about how to achieve that. The last comment here, think about enforcement. One thing you need to think about is that often on the internet, people are going to do what they're going to do. And they can do stuff that's against the terms that you put out. You may not be able to stop them. And that is what it is. And it's still worthwhile telling people what you want, because most people will honor that. But, you know, licenses aren't magic. They don't enforce themselves. The second thing you want to think about is, how are you going to be distributing your assets? So obviously, you know, if you're building worlds, mostly that's going to be within the context of VRChat. But this is more about, like, if you make prefabs, I assume most of you make prefabs. If you make avatars, any sort of asset, you want to think about, how do you intend to distribute it? So, you know, a big way is through various stores, the Unity store, VCAT, Booth. Those all have their own terms of service about what you can do. And that will put some limits on what you're able to call for in your license. For example, the terms of service on the Unity store don't allow you to require attribution in the license. You can use a variety of licenses, but not ones that require attribution. And so that puts some limits. And if attribution is really important to you, maybe you don't want to use the Unity store for your stuff. Booth and VCAT, as far as I know, do not put significant limits on it. However, I don't trust the translations of their terms of use, so there may be aspects I don't know about. But my impression is that Booth and VCAT have a lot more free-form licensing regime. You can kind of put whatever you want in the licensing section. Another option is you can distribute it yourself. You know, you can put stuff up on Dropbox or Google Drive, or any number of other places. You may have your own website. And those are great in that you can do whatever you want there. You can control the release. Of course, you then have to pay for the hosting. And then in some cases, you may be distributing things directly. So if you're doing commissions for one person, you're not making it publicly available. You're just, sending the final asset to the commissioner. So that's the other thing that you want to think about before you kind of think about what kind of license do I want to use. Which brings us to what kind of licenses might you want to use. We're going to start with the ones that are what you might call plug and play licenses, prefab licenses. These are the ones you've probably heard of, where there's a license out there, people kind of know what it is, it's been drafted by lawyers, and you can just kind of slap it on and it's easy. And that is great. The only limitation is that it may not do what you want. So first we're going to talk about Creative Commons. There are 7 Creative Commons licenses. They do different things, but there are basically 3 variables that you might care about that Creative Commons deals with. The first one, like we talked about, is attribution. The second is derivative works. So if you want to distribute something and have people be able to access it freely, but not to change it, that's something Creative Commons can do for you. And then the last thing is whether you want virality of the license, whether you want anything that someone does with your work to be covered, that they cover what they do with the same license that you used. And so to run through them. So the first one is the CC0 license. And that's one where you don't want to put any limitations. That's one you just want to say, like, look, to the extent that I can, I'm not claiming copyright on this. You can do whatever you want with it. It's the most permissive license. The main reason it exists is that, when you just put something out on the internet, people might be like, well, that seems cool. I want to check it out, but am I going to get in trouble? What are they going to do? There's no license, there's no clarity. And so when you put in the public domain license, you're making clear to your users, you can use this. You can use it any way you want. You are safe from me. The second one is the attribution license. When you put that license on something, it says you can distribute this, you can do whatever, you can change it, you can do whatever you want. You just have to make clear that I did this part of it. Attribution share alike. It's like attribution, but again, there's a requirement that if you do something based on this work, you have to put this license on it. It has to stay in this relatively open space. Attribution, no derivs. Again, you kind of get the point here. You got to do attribution, can't do derivative works, can't change anything about the asset. And then attribution non-commercial. I was wrong. There's one other variable, which is commercial use. So attribution non-commercial is, I want you to give me credit, and I don't want you to use what you do with this for any sort of commercial use. They all involve attribution, except for public domain. And then there's the ones that are just combos of the others. Attribution non-commercial share alike. You have to credit me. You can't use it commercially, and you have to put this license on anything else that you do with it. And then attribution non-commercial, no derivs. You have to credit me. You can't use it commercially, and you can't change it. You can't do anything based on it. Creative Commons is pretty well known, and the licenses are pretty simple, and they're well drafted. And so if those sets of situations describe you, then they're a real good choice for that. If you need something else, then that's going to be an issue. The second category of prefab licenses you might look at is the open source licenses, which are mostly used for software, but can also be used for digital assets of other kinds. The 3 most popular ones that are potentially relevant are the MIT license, the BSD license, and the Apache license. They basically all do the same thing. There's kind of 3 prongs to it. 1, attribution. You have to credit me when you do whatever you're going to do. 2, you can do whatever you want to do. You want to make derivative works? Great. You want to use commercially? Great. Whatever. And then the third is, if you get yourself into deep trouble doing whatever it is that you do, that is not on me. I have no liability for that. Those are the 3 clauses that are in the major, relatively light open source licenses. There are varying lengths. MIT and BSD are short, Apache's long, but it's basically the same material. There are other open source licenses that are a little heavier. You may know the GPL. For the most part, those licenses I don't think are appropriate for digital assets. They are complicated. There's a lot involved, and frankly, I wouldn't recommend that you use them without having a lawyer talk to you about what's going on. So those are the pre-made licenses, which brings us to custom terms of use. Terms of use like you see on a website, and which I know a lot of artists use for their publicly distributed materials. And you can put whatever you want in there. Because, like we said, a contract can be anything. You can put whatever you want, and because you're saying, hey, these are the terms under which you can use it, that can be a contract. However, if you're not thoughtful about how you draft it, you're not going to achieve the clarity that we're looking for. So for example, I've seen terms of use where the first line is no restrictions, you can do whatever you want with this, and then a couple lines down it says no commercial use. And that, which one are you saying? So you want to kind of think about it, be clear, be consistent within your terms of use. And because you want to think about it and be clear on what you're trying to do, I recommend you don't just copy someone else's from online, because that does what they want it to do. It may not do what you want it to do. But you don't need a lawyer to do this. You just need to be clear about what it is that you want, and then you need to say it. Which brings us to commissions. Situations where someone is paying you specifically to make stuff for them specifically. Again, it doesn't have to be very complicated. It doesn't have to be very formal. What it has to be is clear. You need to communicate with your client about what it is that they want in detail, and how are you going to get it done for them, and how are they going to pay you. And for this, a written agreement is really helpful because it gets everything that you want to deal with in one place. It's all in one place. You can both say, hey, this is the agreement. All right, we know what we're going to do, and we know what we have to talk about if something has to change. And this doesn't have to be printed. You can have an email. You can have a binding contract in text messages or DMs, but it is absolutely best practices to get everything in one place, so you can both be like, yes, this is the agreement, and you don't have misunderstandings that way. Some specific things that you should think about, and these may seem elementary, but a lot of people kind of feel like some of this is implied, or goes, you can take it for granted, and then it turns out no, you can't. So those issues are, the big one is price. How much are you paying? People don't usually forget that one, but they do sometimes forget how are you paying, when are you paying, what happens if you don't. That goes back to the enforceability problem. But thinking that through and being specific, always useful. The second thing is, what exactly are you doing? And when are you doing each part of it? So if, for example, you're doing multiple assets or multiple stages, maybe there's a, hey, I'm going to do the draft by this date, so you can see how it's going. We can talk about it if anything needs to change, and then the final deliverable will be on this date. Thinking about that kind of thing very clearly is very useful. Change orders. What happens if someone wants to change it? What happens if the client says, you know what, I thought about it, I want it to be purple instead? Do they have to pay you more? How late in the game can they make changes before you start having to talk about changing the whole thing? And then the last one gets back to the IP side of things, is which rights are transferred? Because one of the things in intellectual property that confuses people, the classic example is wedding photos. People hire photographers, they pay them a lot of money to come take pictures of their wedding. And then they find out afterwards that they don't own the pictures. They get to pay the photographer more for copies of the pictures because the photographer created those pictures and owns the copyright. And people get very upset about that. And so it's good to be clear about, well, who owns things? Like if I commission something from you are you selling me the copyright? Or are you just selling me a license to use it in certain ways? And this is a big one where people's expectations are not always in the same place. And so it's good to be clear about what are those terms, what are the limitations on what rights are being transferred. And that is the major topics I wanted to get through. We have, it looks like 10 minutes left if there are any questions. If you have other questions beyond that, you can reach me at Discord or at Twitter.
Okay, same as yesterday, we have a question zone over there. So if you have any questions, please line up and get into the circle one by one. And yeah, should be good.
Yeah, good in there. So I was wondering, since I do commission work, I'm doing one currently. So when I distribute the assets to them, should I like give them a written document, like a notepad or something, saying, "Hey, you own all the rights to this," to make sure nothing ever happens in the future? Or so they can like do their own DMCAs and whatnot, since for them to own the right to that model.
That is actually an excellent point. DMCAs are for a lot of people one of the big issues that can come up. I think it would, if they want that, I think that would make a lot of sense. I'm not sure that's really on you. You know what I mean? Like if they didn't ask for it when you made the agreement, you don't have to do it. But certainly I think it might be good client service to say like, hey, do you want some sort of written assignment of the IP here? And they can say yes or no.
Yeah.
You could even say, hey, I'm going to need more money for the assignment of rights, but that might not be very classy.
But putting that on a notepad when sending the model file, is that good enough for something like that, or does it have to be something more?
Just like sending a text file along with the assets?
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Like by notepad, do you mean like the Windows software?
Yes. That's what I meant.
Yeah. That would.
Yeah, like a
that's
text
fine.
file.
I mean, if you think about it, like when you download software, right? Often the EULA is just a text file. So that's absolutely fine. I should say the reason that people do all of the formalities is that if there's a dispute and lawyers and courts get involved, you get into issues of how do you prove it. And when you've got the more concrete your agreement is, the easier it is to prove to an outside party, here's what we intended. However, for most digital asset work, the amount of money you're dealing with, it's almost never going to be worth getting lawyers and courts involved. And so what you need to do at this level is just try to avoid the dispute from happening in the first place.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Hello. First of all, thanks a lot for your talk. I was wondering, we talk about commercial use, but nowadays we have ads, we have YouTubers, we have streamers, we have patrons. What counts as commercial? I was wondering.
Well, and that's the thing. There's not a legally defined, that's not in the law. That is a term that you have to work out, and to some extent you can leave it, there's some amount of common sense involved. But you're right that is it commercial use if you use something on a stream where you're getting ads or donations? People have different feelings about that. And that's why it's good, if you know that that's a situation that might happen, to talk about it. To say I don't want you doing this kind of work. That's what I mean by commercial use. There's not sort of this is commercial use in all situations. Now I should say, actually, this is one of the shortcomings of the Creative Commons licenses. Because there are these categories that are relevant that aren't very clear on the line between commercial and non-commercial. So that is a shortcoming of the prefab licenses.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was wondering, how is it definition-wise, where, for instance, fair use comes into place, and how would you define it, or even defend against it, or plead for it? How do these boundaries happen? what could constitute, especially in the context of like avatars or worlds. You see people basically recreating a lot of things from their favorite media, and where could fair use go, and where does it end?
So this actually is a tricky topic, and this so a cynical thing that we say in IP law is fair use is the right to hire a lawyer. There isn't a very clear line about what is fair use, what is not fair use. I will say, almost any time, like you see a YouTube video where there's a long thing at the beginning where they talk about how what they're doing is fair use, it almost certainly isn't. People on the internet have bad understandings of what fair use means. Fair use, there are a lot of different types of fair use, but in general, fair use is when you are using something because you needed that thing in order to comment on it, right? So like if you're making, I don't know, a parody of some anime, right? Well, if you're making a parody, you need to be able to, at some level, copy the characters and the situations, because otherwise you can't do the parody. That's sort of a core fair use kind of situation. Or if you need to comment on things.
Yeah, like a good example in VRChat, like the Knuckles thing. It's basically a Sonic or Sega-owned character that has been satire modified, and yeah. So would that, for instance, be fair use or outside?
Again, there's not a hard and fast rule on this, because at the end of the day, a court has to decide. There's a bunch of different factors, and a court has to kind of work out, how do they weigh. But in general, something like that, I think, is more likely to be fair use. A lot of people think that fair use and non-commercial are the same thing. That they're like, oh no, I just wanted to rip this character because I love it so much, and no one's paying me for it. That feels like it should be fair. But that's not what fair use is for. So that kind of thing is not likely to be fair use in the legal sense.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, mostly, yeah.
Terrific.
Hi. So an earlier question brought up that sending in like a text document with your asset, that would, constitute coverage. But at what point should you be asking them to like sign a document, like an online signature type thing?
As I said, it's about enforceability, and so that's up to you.
Does it hold up better if worst comes to worst?
Yeah, if you've got someone's signature on something, it's a lot easier. If they say no, we never agreed to that, and then you're like, you signed this document.
Right.
If this wasn't our agreement, you should have said something before you signed it. That's the use of signatures. Now, I'll say, like I said, it's almost never useful in this arena to bring in lawyers in courts. Where you may come into play is if you have to talk to platforms. You got to talk to an asset store where someone is selling your stuff. You got to talk to VRChat where someone's doing something. In those situations, it may help to have a more robust paper trail. But it's not like a limit. It's not like this is enough, this is not enough. The more detailed documentation you have, the more safety you have. But at the same time, it's a lot of work, and it may not be worth it for you. So, yeah, I don't know that's a very helpful answer, but that's how it is.
No, that's good. Thank you.
Okay, I have two questions from the live stream chat. First one is from Legends.
Can I just interject? Are we good on time? Because I see the...
Yeah, we're fine. We started a bit earlier, so we can definitely take
Yeah,
last
we're
question.
definitely good at time.
Great.
Yeah. First one is from Legends. Can you give your client the terms of use when you send them the project file, or should you agree on that before you do any payment?
You should agree on it beforehand. Yeah, you should work... because think about it. You should work out what are the conditions for how you're going to do this work together before you do the work. If you send them the terms of use at the end, they may respond like, what? That's not what I wanted. That's not what I thought was going to be the case. And completely aside from an issue of who's in a right, I mean, you don't want people to be upset with your work because they thought it was going to be something other than it is. Now, if you're in the middle of a commission right now, it may be not a bad idea to reach out to your client and be like, hey, I just wanted to kind of, make explicit what are the parameters of our deal. But in general, you always want to do it ahead of time.
Thank you for that. The second one is from Centauri. If you have a contract with the company that doesn't explicitly state that the work you create for them is owned by them, is it implicit that the work is owned by me or owned by the company?
It's owned by you.
Okay.
Unambiguously, it's owned by you. Now, two caveats. One, there's what they call work for hire. Work for hire is when you are their employee. When you work for them, the work you do for them belongs to them. And there are a limited set of circumstances where a contract relationship can create a work for hire. It's a whole list, and I don't remember it off the top of my head. But it kind of has to do with if a company is hiring you to make more of like their stuff, they're more likely to own the rights. But in general, if you're in a contract situation, the company should be asking you to assign rights if they want to own them. If they didn't do that, then they don't. There's some issue here of implied license. Like if the whole point of it was, hey, we need you to make this asset for this purpose, you're kind of going to need to let them do the purpose because that was pretty clearly part of the deal. But the actual ownership, if it wasn't transferred, it stays with you.
Okay, then I think that would answer that then. So thank you.
Great.
And that was it.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, so if that's everyone, thank you so much for coming. Again, if you have any questions, I'm happy to talk.